Anthony DiLorenzo here alongside Sarah Azari, and we're wrapping up another week in the Diddy trial.
Anthony, let's go again.
I'm Anthony DiLorenzo alongside criminal trial attorney Sarah Azari outside the federal courthouse. We're wrapping up another week in the Diddy trial, and today we had a big name on the witness stand. Kid Cudi, Scott Mescudi, he used to date Cassandra Ventura, and he testified about his beef with Diddy. Specifically, the car bombing, the break-in of his house. What specific testimony does this go to in terms of the charge?
It goes to racketeering. You know, the arson is a textbook predicate act for racketeering. The intimidation of going into the home and, you know, taking apart the security cameras, putting the dog away. It's almost like he's sending a message to intimidate. That obviously goes to the racketeering as well, to the means and methods of the racketeering. But here's the problem, you know, the defense is, I think they got that on cross-examination. There was no arrest or prosecution for that arson.
The police came.
The police came, nothing ever came of that. And Cudi on the stand admitted that he assumed it was Combs just because of the situation with Cassie, the idea that Cassie was two-timing. And I think the defense did a really good job on cross by eliciting testimony that Cassie was living a double life. She's deceptive.
They said, in fact, that Cudi and Diddy both got played by Cassie.
Yeah, so you both got played, the attorney said. That was great.
So that was a moment, and obviously this is all circumstantial evidence at this point because they said they took fingerprints, they took DNA samples, and nothing definitively linked, I guess, Diddy, but maybe they just didn't have a match?
Not only that, but his car, apparently the DNA matched
a woman?
Female, yeah. And so,
that was objected to, I believe.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, it's one of those things where you can't unring a bell. The jury heard it. They're not supposed to consider it, but they already heard it.
Yeah, we don't know whose female hair it was. In fact, it could have been Cassie's in the car because they were dating at the time.
Sure.
And we learned today that they really had been dating for about a year's time. And there were some points where he talked about, yes, Cassie told me about abuse. I don't believe he ever talked specifically about sexual abuse with her.
Right. He actually denied any allegation of sexual abuse or any accusation by Cassie of sexual abuse, but more about the physical abuse.
Okay, and there was that email that Cassie sent to her mom right before they broke up.
Right.
That said, I'm scared for my life. Scott, Kid Cudi's scared for his life because Diddy said he was going to do something to both of us and it wouldn't be at his hands. Mm-hmm. Does that mean using his staff, the racketeering?
Yeah, using the enterprise, essentially. And remember that I think Cassie's mom, that was in the context of a $20,000 demand that Combs had made to her mom, essentially, pay me back for what I've spent on your daughter. I'm sure he spent more than $20,000, but nonetheless, he didn't keep it, he returned it. So we're starting to see this interplay of what Cassie testified to and what some of these other witnesses are corroborating.
Certainly, and so then after they went home for Christmas, they come home, they break up, and about 9 days later, Cudi had his car blown up, and finally he says, all right, enough of this, we've got to have a face-to-face meeting. They go to the Soho House in LA and they talk about it. So one of the more lighter moments of the day is when he said that he entered the room at the Soho House to Diddy looking like some kind of Marvel super villain. And the jury actually laughed.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, but you know, look, obviously Cudi was not afraid of him. Twice he tried to go and meet with him. Once he met with him. You know, he was at his house, supposedly. That's the time where he allegedly was, you know, the house was burglarized or whatever. Not burglarized, but tampered with, vandalized. And, you know, he showed up to have a conversation. So he's not that scary or intimidating, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, he did at one point say he wasn't sure if he had any weapons. The defense had some concern over that. They talked about Capricorn Clark being with Diddy when he allegedly broke into the house. And we're actually going to hear from Capricorn Clark next week. She was an assistant of Diddy and she keeps coming up time and time again, so she's a central figure in Diddy's world, so we're going to hear from her next week.
I also want to know if we're hearing, I mean, you're obviously in the courtroom, so I'm curious if Christina Coram, his chief of staff, is going to testify.
We keep hearing from her about her.
She's definitely a co-conspirator, and she's probably either been given immunity or some sort of a deal, and that's going to come up in cross-examination.
So something that George Kaplan, who was the other witness today, an assistant of Diddy's for a few years, talked about how he went to Capricorn Clark this was his direct boss, and he said that he was concerned about what he was seeing in terms of physical abuse that Sean was committing on Cassie and his other girlfriend Gina, and he told the jury
was that
this
apple that was thrown?
Yeah,
was
the
that
apples.
Gina?
So he was
and Gina
throwing,
is not testifying, which is interesting.
Right. So he said that Capricorn said this was the first. Christina said this was the first time she had ever heard of anything like this, and she had been in that orbit for a long time then.
Yeah.
So did she not know? Was she lying? She seemed genuinely surprised, he said.
Well, I think that as a chief of staff, she might not be around Combs in all of these hotel rooms and en route and traveling and this and that. I think she may have had more of a backstage kind of role in his orbit. So it makes sense that the people that are rolling with him, the executive assistants, the assistants, etc., they would be the ones to actually know these details. I wouldn't say that necessarily she's lying. That could also be a possibility. But I think what was interesting about George Kaplan's testimony is that he really likes Diddy. Even now, he didn't want to testify against him.
So talk about that. He was given prosecutorial immunity.
Yeah.
He was ultimately first going to plead the fifth when they called him, but then they made a deal with him?
Well, the judge gave him immunity so that he could testify because technically he's a material witness for the government. But, you know, I understand why he was asking for immunity is because he was picking up drugs. He was dealing with a lot of baby oil and Astroglide, which by itself is not illicit. But in the context of this, you know, sexual gratification of the head of this criminal enterprise, you know, then it becomes relevant. And so, you know, he was concerned about the cash, the drugs, and all the stuff that he was around. So I understand why he didn't. And also the fact that he didn't report or do anything about the 2 instances of violence that he had witnessed. Now remember, he said that 2 instances of violence occurred, and that this was interestingly both in 2015, which is when he quit. To me, that stood out because Cassie's hotel incident that we saw on tape is from 2016. I bet you the defense is going to make a thing about his drug addiction and what was going on in his life at that time, 2015, 2016. This was probably like a very bad period, dark period for Diddy. And you know, the defense is going to try to say these are aberrant behaviors limited to this part of his life, that he's not running a criminal enterprise using violence to execute the purpose of the enterprise.
I'm trying to think, has anyone testified before 2015 that Cassie was being abused? There must have been.
I don't remember any, but I think that the big focus seems to be on 2015, 2016.
2011, she went home to her mom for Christmas.
Oh, and she had bruises.
And he said she kicked her in the back. So yes, there had been alleged abuse going on way before that. Drug use been going on way before that. And just to put a bow on George Kaplan, he said that Diddy was a god among men. He invited him to his wedding. He still wishes him happy birthday. So this is a guy who really likes him. However, his moral compass really was what guided him away from Diddy. He said that it really shook him tremendously to see how Diddy was treating women, and ultimately that's why he had to leave. So who do you think George Kaplan helped more, the defense or the prosecution?
I mean, you know, I always say this isn't baseball. We can't really say who's ahead. We're still in the case in chief for the prosecution. I think the defense is doing a great job poking holes at the case. But I think we're going to see a lot of juicy stuff come out in the defense case.
Okay, well, there's more to come. We are in the long holiday weekend.
One more thing to add. There were hotel records from the Hermitage Hotel in Los Angeles, and a hotel employee or some management position employee.
The GM.
Yeah, the GM testified about those records, and you know, the fact that Combs used Combs as his name, but also these aliases like Frank Black and all kinds of different names over the years, and as recently as 2019. And you know, I just want to say, to me, look, the government is also alleging that there's obstruction of justice as part of this racketeering, that he was trying to hide his conduct and silence people, and so that's why he's using these names. No, he's a big, giant mogul. He's a music star. You know, he's a celebrity. Celebrities use aliases. Nobody wants to know where they're at a given time. And going back to George Kaplan, the fact that he was cleaning up the room. Look, if I had a ton of drugs on the table and Astroglide and Baby Johnson, I'm no no Diddy or Tupac, but I don't want that stuff around either, right? So I think that doesn't mean that he's doing something illicit and sex trafficking.
But I think what that goes to is that it's corroborating Cassie's testimony is how they had to cover all the furniture. There was baby oil on the walls. There was candle wax on the floor.
Because, look, your sex life is a private thing. It's the most private thing, and you're in a hotel. Of course you don't want stuff like that around. So I don't think this is, at some point this jury is going to see that this was a freaky sort of fetish, right? And that's not a crime. And so the issue is really going to become whether this was sex trafficking and racketeering for the sexual gratification of Sean Combs.
We will see what the jury decides. Ultimately, still many more weeks ahead of us. Combs today seemed pretty confident in his defense's ability. So ultimately, this rests, of course, in the jury's hands. We will see you back here on Tuesday.